Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to what I'm sure will be another enormously interesting and fascinating presentation in March of the Living Australia's ongoing series of online educational events. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. A few months back on Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, we were privileged to share in what many commented was a breathtaking presentation organized by International March of the Living on the topic of medicine and morality, lessons from the Holocaust and COVID-19. Today's presentation, a patient, a nurse, 18th March 1941, is a follow-on to the theme and the underlying elements of the Hippocratic Oath, namely the obligations and pledges of medical practitioners to prescribe only beneficial treatments and to refrain from causing harm or hurt, are at the core of some of the major dilemmas that this topic and today's presentation continue to grapple with. We are thrilled to have two wonderful presenters today, Heather Abramson, an educator and second-generation Holocaust descendant, and Dr. Darren O'Brien, a nurse, academic, and scholar of the Holocaust, whose paths quite fortuitously and serendipitously crossed by virtue of their connections and interest in this topic. And now, without further ado, it's over to Heather and Darren.
Okay.
You start.
Thanks very much, Cedric. Thanks everybody for joining us. The format of today's presentation is a little bit unusual in that, as Cedric mentioned, my research interests collided with your family history.
Yeah.
So Heather and I decided to tag team a presentation where we tried to align both histories together, which was quite difficult, but we hope that you'll see where things come together. And we'll both tag team and interject each other and
Yes.
add little details as we go along. Okay. Yep. Okay. Next. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Can everyone see that slide?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking a little bit about my family, because my father was born in Dresden, in Saxony, in East Germany, in 1909. So he was quite an old dad for me. He was 46 when I was born. And here in the pictures, which thank God he managed to bring from Germany with him, is his younger sister, Susa, who was born in 1913, and a picture of the two of them together. So his name was Franz and her name was Suzanne, but she got known, in the family they called her Susa. So my name, for those of you who've known me before I was married, my name was Firestone. And that was because my dad eventually changed Feuerstein into Firestone, but it's the same name. Thanks, Darren. So this is Dad's sister Susa when she was about 12 in 1925. And this is the house that they lived in Dresden, number 22 Walletstrasse. And I haven't been inside it, but I've seen it from the outside. And it's in the old part of Dresden, and it actually survived the firebombing. It was on the very, very edge of the area that was firebombed. And this is Susan as a young woman. She had very sad eyes by that time. And Darren has offered to assist me or to be my co-author. I'm writing a book about her, and he's helping me with the research, God bless him. And we're trying to find out as much as we can about her early life. And he's going to take over.
Yeah, so from my previous research experience in Dresden especially, I researched a guy called Helmut Schramm for my PhD and wrote a chapter on him. He was very prolific in writing about the blood libel, the so-called ritual murder accusation. He published a book on it that reached Himmler. He was from Dresden, and we'll explore what happens in Dresden as we go through this presentation.
That's just a little bit of more family history. That's my grandparents, Leon and Elise Feuerstein, and my uncle. His name was Hans Gerhard, and they called him Gerd. And when he came to Australia, he eventually called himself Jack, but he was known to the family as Gerd.
So Heinrich Gley is a nurse. He was born in 16th February 1901, and I've been researching him for a few years now. He was born up in the north of Germany, quite provincial. By the age of 18 years old, he joined the Reichswehr via the rump of the army. At the time, he achieved the rank of corporal. So, he wished to join the army. He's quite nationalist, even as a young man. By 28 years old, he became a student nurse and then worked in the New Strelitz hospital. So that map there, you can see Berlin in the center and New Strelitz is up the top. Beautiful area of the countryside with lakes surrounding it, forests. He was married in 1929 and ended up having 5 children. By the time he was 31 years old, he joined the Nazi Party, and that's his party card there on the right with his membership number. Says he was a healthcare worker, and he was working in this hospital in New Strelitz. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on eugenics theory as such. It's the topic for another talk where we've got a lot more time just to focus on that. But essentially, there was this international movement based on this theory of breeding better stock in people and reducing the reproduction of people with less desired traits that stem from the work of Galton. And as I said, this became an international movement from the English to the Americans to the Germans. There was a World Eugenics Federation that was established by 1921, looking at all these different strands of science and social science, genetics, biology, law, all feeding up into this tree of this concept called eugenics and this belief that eugenics is a self-direction of human evolution. In the US, there was public propaganda, for want of a better word, making it popular that if we maintain the breeding of optimum people and separate those that were less desirable in the society, then that will preserve the future strength of the people in the US. So here we have a couple of, on the right's feature out of a newspaper. The feeble-minded breed feeble-minded, we pay the cost. So looking at the cost of maintaining people who are termed feeble-minded. On the left, if this man had been sterilized, there would not have been born 1 asocial female, 4 deaf and dumb, 3 stammerers, 2 epileptics, 1 mentally deficient female, 1 deformed abnormal female, together 12 hereditarily diseased. In Germany, you've probably seen this image before. Once again, looks at the economic cost, 60,000 Reichsmark. This is what this person suffering from hereditary defects costs the community during his lifetime. Fellow citizen, that is your money too. It's an advertisement for a publication produced by the Race Policy Office at the time. This is from a flyer of the Human Betterment Foundation in the US, talking about where sterilization had been undertaken in which states and when laws were first commenced. So here we have the number or the different names of the states and what year a law on compulsory sterilization was put into place, and then the numbers of males and females that have been sterilized each year. So this is up to January the 1st, 1936, and giving us the totals. So Hitler becomes Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, and very quickly on the 14th of July, he goes straight into instituting laws to regulate these hereditary diseases. And he was familiar with the eugenics literature and the racial hygiene movement in Germany. So this law focused on anyone suffering from a hereditary disease who could be sterilized by a surgical operation if, according to the experience in medical science, it is to be expected with great probability that his offspring will suffer from serious hereditary physical or mental defects. And it goes through the list. Mental deficiency from birth, schizophrenia, manic depressive, hereditary epilepsy, hereditary St. Vitus dance, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, serious hereditary physical malformations. Furthermore, people suffering badly from alcoholism can be sterilized. There's also that extended into prostitution, homosexuality.
Yeah.
Hereditary courts were set up, eugenics courts, where if you were deemed to have a hereditary defect, you had to go and present to prove otherwise as to why you shouldn't be subjected to sterilization. And once the court had finally decided on sterilization, it must be carried out even against the will of the person to be sterilized. The civil service doctor has to request the necessary measures from the police authorities. Where other measures are insufficient, direct force may be used. So there was no option out of this. German sterilizations began in January 1934, and even in the American papers, it was being published, 400,000 Germans to be sterilized, 1,700 hereditary health courts to start judging cases. This advertisement, once again from the publication of New People, sterilization is not punishment, but liberation. What parent would like to wish their children such a terrible lot? Who wants to be guilty of this? So promulgating this kind of thought into the population. In September 1935, two new laws, the Nuremberg Laws, as you're well aware of, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, prohibited marriages and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans, so separation along bloodlines, and the Reich citizenship law, that only those with German or related blood were deemed Reich citizens. And they went down the path of determining those with full blood, with half blood, with mixed blood, and determining Jewish or German hereditary. And this was very much a global thing, even in Australia, even to the late 1940s. The talk of quadroon, octoroon, blood discrepancies with Aboriginals compared to white Australians. Nuremberg laws showing mixed blood, full-blooded Germans, Jews, and the descendants from grandparents. And depicted in textbooks of the time, racial hygiene textbooks, photographs, and these stemmed from much earlier. Galton was taking photographs of alcoholics and criminals and looking at physical characteristics. Eugen Fischer in Namibia was doing the same thing. These pictures here of the German boy, 13-year-old German boy, 14-year-old Jewish boy, German girl, Jewish girl, and then the mixture, Mischling first degree, father German-blooded, mother Jewess, and the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer talking about, instituting some kind of death penalty for race defilement, keep the blood separate. The Stürmer newspaper in 1943, so this is a little bit later, but it featured that same kind of thought process. Here we have the title Infectious Germs Under the Microscope. And down the bottom, when he's poisoned, the Jew destroys the sluggish blood of weaker peoples so that a diagnosis arises of swift degeneration. With us, however, the Germans, the case is different. The blood is pure. We are healthy.
Yeah, before I go on and tell you about this one, I just want to mention something that occurred to me when you were talking about USA, because Henry Ford actually ran a newspaper. He was totally anti-Semitic,
Yeah,
and he
absolutely.
ran a newspaper against the Jews with all of this stuff.
Yep.
Okay, so in 1935, this is my grandparents, Elise and Leon Feuerstein, 51 and 57 years old respectively, and that was what their city looked like. They still look pretty happy there, and it's all a bit hard for me to understand because there was a lot of Nazi activity, and I've seen photographs of big rallies. They stayed till 1935 because the grandma was living with them and she wasn't prepared to leave Dresden. But after her death, I wish they'd left, but I don't know all the reasons why.
So Gley, by this time, 1934, he was still working as a nurse. He moved out of the main hospital, New Strelitz, to this little provincial state hospital nursing home called Domjuk near New Strelitz. And the new director arrived roughly a year later. His name was Dr. Schmidt. That's a photo of him there in the middle. Just want you just to remember his name. By this time, there were 274 patients there, or actually a little bit later, 1939, 134 females, 140 males. This is what the male nurses look like, and the females here, patient there in the middle. Some of these were student nurses. Gley is not pictured in this picture, and that's what the New Strelitz or Domjuk institution looked like, right on the lake. So Adolf Hitler was already seen as a doctor of the German people. So there's this total biomedical model to the racial hygiene component of the Nazi movement. Rudolf Hess is famously quoted as well in 1934 that National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. So nurses were instrumental in fulfilling this racial and eugenic aspiration. They were frontline healthcare personnel. They acted as advocates for racial health. They facilitated preservation and growth of pure-blooded Germans and Lebensborn movement. Nurses counseled people about race hygiene and hereditary diseases. They're involved in the segregation, sterilization, and eventually the eradication of the racially inferior. They conducted within a scientific and medicalized model that had become infused with Nazified theory. Physicians provided diagnosis of racial illness versus racial health. Physicians provided medical orders, instructions for sterilization or destruction, and nurses' assistants to the doctors carried out the instructions. New People also talked about this concept of the revolution of the mind. We were overthrowing old values in our pursuit of a racial utopia, dispensing with morals, dispensing with things that have governed us in the past. The nurses saw themselves as part of this revolution of something new. They saw themselves in a predominantly female-dominated profession with some importance, with purpose, employment, opportunity, advancement, and duty. Participation with the doctors in the advancement of healthcare, race hygiene, as well as the Reich. Some pictures there of the female nurses especially. The male nurses also felt part of this. Gley, this document, this letter from New Strelitz or from Domjuk, down there you can see Dr. Schmidt's signature from the 3rd of November 1938. It's a letter requesting admittance of Gley for participation in an exam on the care of the insane from the director of the Provincial State Hospital Nursing Home Domjuk. There's his name there, amongst other students.
And they were selecting out promising nurses, weren't they? For
this was just the nursing. This was just that exam. So
right.
That's a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Then came Kristallnacht, 9th of October, wasn't it?
November.
November
Yep.
1938.
Yep.
And life certainly changed wildly for my German family at that point. My grandfather and my father were arrested. Dad was beaten up. My grandfather was released from jail, and they were taken to the Dresden jail. My grandfather was released fairly soon because there was a great uprising in the German people complaining about war heroes being jailed. And my grandfather had fought for his Kaiser Wilhelm in World War I, and had won the Iron Cross for valor. And on that occasion, it saved his life. Dad was very badly beaten up, and then a few days later interned at Buchenwald. And you can see in the picture, you can see the Dresden synagogue being destroyed. There were synagogues all around Germany that were destroyed on that night, as well as home invasions, business destructions, rapes, murders, beatings, you name it. It was just this massive pogrom by the German brown shirts to let the Jews know that they were really not welcome in Germany anymore. And you can see that there was actually some money that my grandfather sent to Dad at Buchenwald, which he received when he was released from there.
Yeah, so it shows Leon's address still at Wallertstrasse 22 up there.
Yep.
It was about a 2-hour drive from Dresden to Buchenwald, and these were the documents that they created when he arrived there and when he left there in December 1938. Before we go on, do you want to say why
he was released?
Yeah.
He was released because after Kristallnacht, the Germans took over my grandfather's factory, which made something called embossed show cards, which was a very popular form of advertising. It involved printing and also making three-dimensional the images on the page. And they had 300 workers, and they exported all around the world. And when the Germans took over the company, they couldn't run it. They'd put a local butcher in charge, and he didn't have a clue. So the Germans made a deal with my dad that they would release him from Buchenwald as long as he spent 6 months rebuilding the business and teaching them everything that they needed to know about the business. And he said, well, yes, let's do that, but I'll only accept that deal if I can take my younger brother with me. So that's how the two Feuerstein sons did eventually leave Germany.
So in mid-July, so we've got a little bit of a chronological gap, but by mid-July, possibly, Leon and Elise forcibly moved into Altenzellerstrasse 41.
Yeah, which was called a Jew house. It was a, what do you call it when people are all put together?
Group house,
yeah,
lots of other families.
That'll do, yes. Yeah. So they were forced out of their home. I don't know what they were able to take with them. I don't know. But the Nazis took over the use of their house, which they lived in the top floor of that house that I showed you earlier. So, and it was very comfortable. I mean, they were well-to-do people. So so they then lived in this Jewish ghetto, and those are the forms on the side that show them moving.
Yeah, so these are the registration documents and the details of their employment, the address. They're on the ground floor.
And my grandfather, he's put there as a technical employee. Well, he had been the managing director of this huge factory, but that long before that he had been, his title had been taken down to technical employee, and then he'd been forbidden to work altogether.
Yeah. So World War II breaks out 1st of September 1939, and this famous letter, as most of the medical people in the audience would know, from Buller to Brandt, authorizing what was called a mercy death, but was in reality murder of the so-called euthanasia program. So Buller and Brandt are charged with the responsibility to broaden the authority of certain doctors to the extent that persons suffering from illnesses judged to be incurable may, after a humane, most careful assessment of their condition, be granted a mercy death. That's Brandt and Buller. In the KDF, in the chancellery of the Führer, there's Buller up the top, and then divided into a number of different offices. This one especially just wanted to focus on mainly for the names of the people involved. Hans Heffelmann, just remember his name. And they were instrumental in the Tiergartenstrasse 4 program, also known as Action T4 program, named after Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, which really comprised 4 different offices: the Reichs Association for Healing and Nursing Homes, the Charitable Foundation for Institutional Care, Charitable Corporation for Patient Transport, and the Central Accountancy Department, Healing and Nursing Homes. And all of these names used to disguise the nature of what was going on, and also the role of the Chancellery in governing it. So by August 1939, from the Reichs Ministry of the Interior, where Linden was in charge here, a new law, the duty for midwives to report deformed births, is issued, and midwives had to report on suspected idiocy or Mongolism, particularly involving blindness and deafness, microcephaly, hydrocephalus, deformities of every kind, in particular the absence of limbs, spina bifida, etc. And the midwives would receive a fee of 2 Reichsmarks in return for reporting these. The sum was going to be paid by the Health Office. A few months later, in October, the Reich Ministry of the Interior sends a registration form, questionnaires, out to all the directors of all the hospitals and asylums in the Reich. So that includes Dumjuk in New Strelitz, where mentally ill, epileptics and the feeble-minded are cared for. All patients had to be reported who could not work and suffered from schizophrenia, epilepsy, senile illness, paralysis, not responsive to therapy, feeble-mindedness of all kinds, encephalitis, Huntington's chorea, and other terminal neurological disorders. So this is extending beyond the sterilisation laws of earlier, as well as those in asylums who had been continuously there for greater than 5 years, were confined as criminal lunatics, and especially did not possess German nationality or not of German blood, so Jews, Negroes, or so-called gypsies. So T4 was divided into various departments, and the registrations forms were issued and sent to the healing and nursing homes. The director completed the forms. The Ministry of the Interior assembled them for triaging by a group of doctors. Photocopies of the registration forms were taken, and 3 junior doctors and an overseer doctor assessed the forms on the basis of what was completed as to whether a person was fit to continue living or to die. Selection and recruitment of staff involved in the operation was performed by this department, headed by Allers. There was a transport department where lists were established on the basis of what patients from what institutions would be placed on buses, sometimes trains, and transported to the nearest facility. There was an extra dimension also involved in between institutions where patients were transported in order for subterfuge and to put off relatives inquiring about the locations of their patients, their relatives at different times. But the lists were assembled, sent to the institutional residents to help assemble the patients, and then they were transported and escorted by nurses to the killing facilities. Then the accountancy department not only paid for staffing costs, but also calculated saving costs and reported back to the relatives on what actually came with bogus causes of death. And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Yep.
This is what a blank form looked like, an English translation, but we'll go through one quite quickly. So this one was completed for a person, a Jewish woman, Jewess there in Vienna from this institution, Am Steinhoff. It was completed by the curator of the institution. She had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but she was also Jewish, and whoever's completed this in the red pencil has underlined schizophrenia there and Jewess. So obviously those were important points when they were evaluating the form. And then down here, this assessment here, useless. So she was so termed useless eater. So these doctors have assessed it with a cross, and then the overseeing doctor has agreed that the cross represents that this person should be sent to their death.
Okay, so when part of the research that we're trying to do is to find out a bit more about Suze's early life, but in 1937, she was hospitalized in the local hospital in Dresden, suffering from psychiatric condition. Later on, she was diagnosed as schizophrenic, but I have my own hesitations about that because the Germans were very keen to label anybody with mental illness as schizophrenic because they wanted to get rid of them. But also there are some other conditions, like a person who's been through major sexual trauma. And what I know about that has come out of a study done in Israel. They tend to show the same behaviors as people with schizophrenia. Anyway, she was put in a local hospital for a short time. Then she was moved to an institution called Arnsdorf, a nursing home. And at that time, we were told by a German friend who actually translated some documents for us that there were only two kinds of institutions. One was for people with TB, and one was for people with either psychiatric illness, complete physical disability or intellectual disability, or any of the other things like epilepsy that they couldn't manage in the community. So Arnsdorf was where she was sent in 1937, and that's the picture of it down the bottom there.
Yeah. So she was a photography apprentice. She was single, no children. Leon and Elise there are listed, mother and father, different address, and we don't yet know why or what that address is. And then the class of admission is lower class, and then from the 30th of the 10th, 39, she moves to upper class, and that had something to do with their diet and food provision. So around the same time, November 1939, Dr. Linden, that we met earlier from the Ministry of the Interior, sends this letter to Domjuk. And he says, in order to carry out war economy related tasks, Dr. Heffelman, who was in Office 2C, you may remember, will soon visit the Domjuk Hospital and Nursing Home. I request the institutional administration to immediately support and assist him in his efforts to select some reliable male and female nurses. So here we have the government writing to this small little provincial nursing and mental health care home looking for staff, reliable staff. So Heinrich Gley, in late 1939, this is documentation from a later investigation. He says, about November 1939, the director of the Institute sent for me and informed me that I had to expect a service obligation because there was some prominent gentleman from Berlin who had looked at the personnel files. In December 1939, the invitation to serve arrived for me. I had to present myself on the 4th of January 1940 in Berlin in the Columbus House. That's a picture of it there. There I met about 40 to 50 people, civilians and sisters, nurses. It appeared a commission consisting of several gentlemen, of which was the credible SA Obergruppenführer Blankenberg, who was also in office too. In a mysterious way, we were committed to secrecy without being told more about our future task. A few days later, I would be driven to Grafenet Castle by bus with other conscripts. So I think you just got to use a bit of your historical imagination to imagine this little provincial nurse has been called up into Berlin to be part of something major.
Yeah.
And 6 euthanasia facilities, as we know, were established in Bernburg, Brandenburg, Hadamar, Grafeneck, Hartheim, and Pirna-Sonnenstein. And here's Grafeneck down the bottom where Gley was sent to. This is a document from a fellow nurse and a list of the nurses that were in attendance there. So you can see Gley's name there. It's headed by Dr. Schumann. And these 2 pictures, very rare pictures from Grafeneck, I'm quite convinced that that is a picture of Gley there. Yeah. He worked on the buses, transporting or escorting nurses from rural or from outside provincial institutions into Grafeneck for murder. Sometimes the patients were handcuffed, sometimes they were given sedatives. So I think the role of the male nurses, especially being stronger in general, had a kind of security component to their role, but certainly by luring people in a sense to their deaths and keeping things as peaceful and calm as possible, they subverted and perverted their nursing care of caring for somebody in a patient escort way to keep things moving functionally and efficiently and in a most expeditious manner to get them to the killing facility. And I think that's one of the most disgraceful things.
And that down the bottom on the right is a picture of one of those buses. Are the windows blanked out in that, Darren?
I think they are. That bus is out the front of Grafeneck Castle.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's the dining room there. This is a picture of the T4 staff in the dining room, and that he's wearing a white coat. These were the drivers, wore different uniform.
Yep.
This is what a transport list would look like. It's not from Arnsdorf, but another state hospital nursing home, but a list of patients that were transferred to Grafeneck by bus. The Grafeneck Killing Centre was divided more or less into 2 parts. The castle was up the top of the hill. It served as staff quarters and administration. The gas chambers were constructed halfway down using existing buildings, but also modifying them. Gas chamber and crematoria was constructed. And the patients arrived through here and were taken into this reception area where they had a last preliminary examination, but the nurses would have escorted them in here and undressed them, marked them, took them apart. So there was a fence across here. It's the crematoria there. They were taken into the gas chamber here, and the bodies were put into the gas chamber. Others were stored in that area there. That's what the gas chamber looked like at Grafeneck, reusing an old building. And
looks like an innocent building, doesn't it?
Yeah. And in that year, from 20th of January 1940 to December 1940, 9,839 people were murdered there. So at the same time?
So at the same time, my dad, Franz, and his brother, Gerd, had made it to England and then sought work in England, and their hope was to bring the rest of the family to England. And then in September 1939, they arrived in 1939 sometime, the war broke out. And initially, life was still fine for them. But after the Battle of, what was it called, Darren?
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, thank you. When the English had to send in all these little boats to rescue the soldiers that were still alive, it was a disastrous loss for them. the Prime Minister decided that it was not safe to have any German men left inside of England because they could form a fifth column. So he ordered that all German males, even if they were just teenage boys up to old men, be collected and taken to a place called Huyton, which was actually a race course, but they set up tents there. And they had about 10,000 people, and they were in the next weeks put onto 3 ships and sent to the colonies, which is what you do with the people you don't want. And 2 of those ships were destined for Canada and 1 for Australia. Dad and his brother were put on the Dunera, which was the second ship to leave. The first ship to leave was called the Anandora Star, and it was torpedoed and sunk within 24 hours of leaving Liverpool. And the poor survivors of that ship were then put on the Dunera to be sent to Australia. And they only sent these ships with one English ship to protect them. The ships were massively overcrowded. This ship was designed to take 1,600 men, and it had about 3,000 to 3,500 people altogether on it. We don't have enough time for me to tell you, but it was a horrendous experience. They were treated very, very badly, and they were torpedoed. One torpedo hit the boat and didn't explode. And the second torpedo went under the boat. The boat was actually lifted up on a wave and it went under the boat. And there are other amazing stories about that journey, but anyone who's interested can look up Dunera and you'll find huge amounts of information. So my dad and his brother had a hideous trip, but they were on their way to safety and they did survive the trip. And then they were all interned as prisoners of war once they got to Australia. So the first place was in outback New South Wales. And my dad was doing pictures for his brother. And that was Hay 1940. And, you know, these guys were nice, young, mostly young Jewish guys. And they were interested in trying to make life as pleasant as possible for themselves. So they started vegetable gardens, and they the older ones taught the younger ones so that they could sit the New South Wales HSC exam, and they played musical instruments if they could get them, or some of them had actually come with them if they were small enough. Anyway, so they were at Hay, and then later they were moved to Tatura in Victoria.
Okay, so meanwhile, Glay in 1941, a little bit later, a few months later, he's transferred to the Perna Sonnenstein Killing Centre, and he becomes head nurse there. And he's joined by Schumann. He also comes from Grafeneck, you remember, and Frieda Kutschke. She comes from Arnsdorf. She was a ward nurse in Arnsdorf State Institution, the same facility that Sousa is located at.
Yep.
And she was also transferred to Perna Sonnenstein on a temporary appointment by T4.
Yep.
So here's an illustration of Arnsdorf and other facilities that were mainly used as transit stations before those patients were sent to the killing institution at Perna Sonnenstein.
So my aunt was chosen for deportation to Perna Sonnenstein for death, and she was transferred there on the 18th of March 1941. And Sonnenstein wasn't very far from Arnsdorf, So they were put on the bus in the morning and transferred there. They were asked to strip down, as Darren told you before, and they were looked at, they were checked out by a doctor. And in each case, the doctor wrote down something about what he was going to put on their death certificate. So each of them had a false death certificate saying that they had died of something normal. But this is actually where the Germans were practicing gas chambers. This is before the gas chambers in the big concentration camps. They were trialing a new technology. They had started killing people in some of these institutions with things like overdoses of barbiturates, things that were much more costly and time consuming. So they were looking for cheap and easy, not merciful. There's nothing merciful about dying in a gas chamber. And one of the things that I've learned from Darren is that it takes 20 minutes for a person to die from carbon monoxide poisoning, which is what they were using at that stage. So she was taken to Pirna Sonnenstein. She was murdered there. And then the Nazi authorities wrote a letter to my grandparents. And my brother, my father and his brother were already in Australia at that time in 1941. And they got a letter, which the Red Cross was helping to get letters for Jewish people out of Germany. So the Red Cross helped to get this letter through. And my grandparents say to them, so the first part of the letter was to Gerd, because it was coming up to his birthday. For today, I must also tell you, my dear Gerd, something very sad. After a short confinement to bed, thrombosis and subsequent embolism, our dear Susa quietly went to eternal sleep in the institution. I think our dear Lord meant very well and released her from her heavy suffering. And that was written by my grandfather, and my grandmother also wrote almost the identical words down below. So they got a letter from the Nazis saying that she had died peacefully in her sleep from an embolism. And they wrote different letters to each one of the victims of this crime. They didn't give bodies to families for proper burial. They immediately incinerated the bodies. And Pirna Sonnenstein was right next to the Elbe River, which is the most beautiful river. And when I have to find this, when I did a PowerPoint just on my family, I wrote, calls from my unburied dead, ash blowing on the howling wind. And those words had come to me before I knew any of this. So it's kind of like, oh, wow. On some deep level, I knew that my aunt suffered terribly. My dad couldn't talk about her, didn't talk about her at all. So I knew that there were some very dark secrets there. And slowly, with the help of Darren and Dr. Jürgen Nietzsche, who's another historian in Germany, and Dr. And Lily Albrecht, who wrote the Dresden Gedenkbuch, which is the memory book. We've been gradually finding out answers and finding out the horrible truths. But the honest thing for me is that I'd rather know than not know. So that's another one of Dad's cards to his brother, 1941, 3rd of September, 1941. And, he's drawn them both in their bunk beds. Now we come to the death of my grandparents, and some of the people who are on the call today have seen, heard me talk about this My grandparents were still living in the Jew house, as far as I know. And they were visited by the SS on April the 25th, 1942. There is some oral history in the family that they had been staying at a home of some non-Jewish friends, not sure. But thanks, David. David's keeping the time for us. Thank you, David. Anyway, the SS came in, they searched the place, and they found fish in the fridge. And at that time, one of the many, many laws that had been passed to make life unbearable for Jews was that they couldn't eat fish. They also couldn't drink milk or butter. Lots of things were forbidden to them. So they were beaten up very, very badly, and they were told to get ready for deportation the next day. Quite a few of their family members had already been deported. They were deported to Riga, and my grandparents never heard from them again. So they knew what was coming. They knew that death was coming, and they actually chose to take their own lives that night, on the night of the 25th to the 26th of April, by sealing up the kitchen and lying on the floor and turning on the gas stove, and they died by gassing themselves. And it's like this, also this cruel irony that they died basically the same way as Susa did, but they had no idea that that's how she had died.
Okay, so the total deaths, as most people know, have read about the euthanasia program, total of 70,000 were murdered in the official stats. These are from the Hartime captured records and the savings that would derive from the accounting department. So Gley had moved from Grafeneck to Perner Sonnenstein. He'd been there when these murders had taken place, these total numbers. In August 1942, he then was reassigned to the Belzec extermination camp, one of the Operation Reinhard camps. The total murders there are transcribed down here from the Herfel telegram. But when Gley was there, over 170,000 people had been murdered there. So this nurse from a provincial location had become a mass killer, been involved in mass murder. The picture of him there with a beer, Gottlieb Hering, who was the commandant of Belzec at the time. And then in April 1943, he then moves to the Poniatova concentration camp and is involved in Operation Ernstfest, so-called a harvest festival massacre of 43,000 remaining Jewish laborers there, grouping all of those survivors in Poniatovia, Majdanek, Troniki, and other sub-camps. And then he ends up in 1943 in Trieste in northern Italy, involved in another operation there at the police camp at San Sabah. Some photos of him here in Italy. There was a trial that took place in regards to the Perner Sonnenstein murders that looked at some doctors and nurses that were involved there. Gley and Kutschke weren't two of those that were there. Most of them got off with very light sentences. Two of the male nurses, though, were sentenced to death for their involvement.
But not Gley.
Gley wasn't convicted. He wasn't tried for any of that. He was investigated in what was called the Belzec trial. So a lot of the record that I've shown you through this presentation was his self-serving explanation of what was going on. So obviously he was looking after his own skin, but that statement was part of a number of interrogations that had taken place. But in the end, he didn't face trial. Only Oberhauser, one of the other guards, non-nurse, faced trial there. Gley got off scot-free. Proceedings against him and three other nurses that were investigated at the time were all cancelled. This is a photo of Gley taken in 1960 with his grandson. He died in 1985 and he remained in contact with Hering's wife for many years afterward. So they had a close relationship. And that's the end.
That's the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was absolutely amazing, fantastic, really fascinating. We did not receive questions via the chat, but if there are questions from the floor, from the audience at the moment, if someone would like to, we can unmute everyone at the moment. And if there are any questions, we've got time for 2 questions possibly, and then we will quickly wrap up. So if there's anyone who would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so.
Well, I'm happy to ask a question. The doorbell rang at the beginning, and maybe you covered this, but I missed how the 2 of you actually met and how you worked out that there was this connection.
I helped organise an exhibition in Brisbane that we brought up from Sydney. You probably saw it in Sydney and Melbourne, the Registered, Persecuted, Annihilated exhibition. And I don't know how you heard about it, Heather.
The advertisement for that exhibition was sent to me by Paul Myers, who's the head of the Jewish Board of Deputies. And I wrote back to him and I said, I'm so interested in this. Thank you so much for sending it to me. There was 4 days that had already happened because you had it at 2 venues. But the next 4 days were at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. And the first 2 days of that were the festival of Shavuot, when I couldn't go. So I wrote to Paul and I said, I'm really, really interested. Won't be able to go for the first 2 days, but I will definitely get there during the last 2 days. And then because of my, and I said to him, my aunt was one of the people who was murdered. So because of my interest and because of also me telling him about my aunt, he put us in contact.
Yeah, so Paul contacted me and we got together, and
yes, and also it just so happened that on the Sunday before Shavuot, just before your exhibition opened at the hospital, I was giving a talk to my local Labor Party branch. I had been invited to give a talk to them about my family. I have a PowerPoint sometimes called The Nazis and My Family. And my wonderful local member, Joe Kelly, he had taken me to another exhibition, which was on at Parliament House, about lots of diplomats who tried to save Jewish lives. And as we'd walked around that exhibition, I told him that my father was a survivor and told him a bit about where he'd come from, and that I actually had prepared a talk that I'd given to a couple of other organizations. And he said, oh, that would be so great if you would do that talk for the branch. So then it was brought up at the branch, and people were asked, would you like Heather to do this talk? Would you be interested? It was not part of a branch meeting. It was something 100% separate, and people had to book to actually physically turn up. We had a little hall, and we had 16 people from the branch who came and heard my talk. But because we'd only spoken on the Thursday night, Darren came to my talk. It was awesome. So he came to my talk, and then a few days later, I went to his exhibition, and I saw a film, a German film, as well as the actual photos in the exhibition. I saw a German film called The Fog.
Fog in August.
The Fog in August. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
No.
Well, it's a film that traces one of these hospitals and all the people in it, and the gradual move from the nurses and doctors from being carers to being killers. And it's based on a real place and based on real people. And in the photographs that were in the exhibition that Darren had brought to Brisbane, you could actually see the real people. And they had managed to cast the film with people with extraordinary likenesses. But it was so chilling. And it just was such an eye-opener to me, because I suddenly had this whole new way of understanding some of the things that had happened to my family. So that's how we began our collaboration, and we've gone from there.
One more question.
Yes, could I ask a question? I'd be interested to know, the people who were nurses and were conscripted to become into the eugenics program, what happened if they said no? What happened to them?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think they were conscripted. There were some that did say no. The most important thing was that you could be relocated. It was just like the Einsatzgruppen, Police Battalion 101. You could kind of move away into some other area to get out of the actual killing component. I think the guy's name was Franz Sitter in Hartheim, who was a nurse there that refused to participate in what was going on, and nothing happened to him. He was sidelined into another area. Those that did get into trouble were those that were involved, but then spoke about what was going on. So they didn't maintain their secrecy. And that was what was important. And there were two that I know of that were sent to a concentration camp for a brief stint, but it was because they didn't maintain secrecy, not because they refused to participate.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, clearly this discussion could have carried on for much longer, but all good things have to end, and I would like to call on my fellow March of the Living Australia Committee of Management member, Dr. Jason Silverstone, to sum up.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you for the fascinating presentation of your family events, how you both met serendipitously, and the very disturbing events at the time, the environment in which there were laws about, you spoke about eugenics and I guess selection of not just survival of the fittest, but selection of those deemed suitable to carry on living. The role played by the medical profession, as you just mentioned now, turning people from carers to killers, which is outright frightening. But the way it was done is something honorable on the back of such blatant propaganda and brainwashing. You spoke about Nuremberg Laws, which years later were led to the Nuremberg trials, which then formed the basis for ethics in the conduct of human research. So when you look at what happened then and now, the focus on human rights and all those initiatives, thank God we've come a long way from then. But a really fascinating recount of events, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of March of the Living and wish you all the best with your ongoing research. Thanks, Cedric.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a departing thank you from me to all of you for attending, and a reminder and invitation to attend our next session, which will take place this Thursday evening at 7:30 p.m. for a talk on the destruction of Lithuanian Jews, the Ponari massacre, and a reminder to follow our latest campaign calling the sport-loving community of the world to join forces in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate in sport by following our socials and hashtag Athletes Against Anti-Semitism. Thank you and have a great evening.